Good morning, everyone. My name is David Blunt. I'm the Clerk of the Parliaments and Clerk of the Legislative Council, and it is my pleasure to be able to welcome you to this, the second in our series of bicentenary history conferences, exploring the origins and development of the Legislative Council and the Parliament of New South Wales. Today, of course, we focus on the New South Wales Act of 1823, which brought into existence not only the Legislative Council, but also the New South Wales Supreme Court. Whether you are here with us in person or joining us online, it is great to have you with us. Your interest in and passion for the history of this great institution is greatly appreciated. It is my honour this morning to introduce the President of the Legislative Council, the Honourable Ben Franklin, to open proceedings. Ben Franklin grew up in regional New South Wales before attending the University of Sydney and settling in Sydney for work. That is, before later relocating to the north coast of New South Wales. Having been State Director of one of Australia's oldest political parties for 7 years, Ben Franklin was elected to the Legislative Council in 2015. He was very soon appointed a Parliamentary Secretary with a range of responsibilities, including, in 2019, steering major legislation concerning the transition to renewable energy through the Legislative Council in some of the longest sitting days in recent memory. In 2021, Ben Franklin became the Minister for Tourism, Aboriginal Affairs, Regional Youth and the Arts. On the 9th of May 2023, he was elected President of the Legislative Council. He is the 23rd President since the advent of responsible government in New South Wales. Please welcome, Mr. President, the Honourable Ben Franklin.
Well, thank you very much, David, for that incredibly warm welcome. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here today to the Parliament of New South Wales for the second in our series of bicentenary conferences commemorating the very fast approaching 200th anniversary of the Parliament of New South Wales. Having been elected as the President of the Legislative Council in May this year, I feel particularly privileged to be the custodian of this office as the Council fast approaches such a significant milestone. Now, before I begin, I'd obviously like to acknowledge and pay my respect to the traditional custodians of the land upon which we all meet today, the Gadigal people, and to extend those respects to elders past and present and thank them for their custodianship of this land for many tens of thousands of years, land that always was and always will be Aboriginal land. I'm mindful that this Parliament has a complex and varied history with Aboriginal people. Some of the decisions made in this place have had serious ramifications for Aboriginal communities, while others have signalled positive change and ensured that Aboriginal voices have been heard. And as we move towards our bicentenary year in 2024, I look forward to supporting a range of events that will provide an important opportunity to explore First Nations perspectives, including some of the difficult and challenging aspects of our history. As a former Minister for the Arts and Aboriginal Affairs, I'm also particularly pleased that this conference has coincided with a special commemorative exhibition to mark the 25th anniversary of the Reconciliation Wall, a space dedicated to the display of Aboriginal art in recognition of the Parliament's commitment to reconciliation with Aboriginal people. We've partnered with the Bamali Aboriginal Arts Cooperative for the exhibition, our very first Reconciliation Wall exhibitors back in 1998. And it's fitting that the word Bamali means to strike, to make a mark in Bundjalung, Gamilaroi and Wiradjuri language, because Bamali's founders did just that when they helped launch our Reconciliation Wall exhibition program 25 years ago. It is this Parliament's privilege to have this new exhibition on display to commemorate the anniversary, and I strongly encourage you all to take a close look over the next couple of days. We've chosen the theme Reflect, Celebrate, Imagine to mark our bicentenary, inviting our community to reflect on the Council's 200 years history, celebrate the Council's development into a robust, modern House of Review, and imagine how it will continue to evolve into the future. And this conference provides the perfect platform to reflect, celebrate, and imagine, and I'm genuinely delighted to be joining you at the launch of these proceedings today. Last year's conference placed us firmly in the 1820s, exploring the early history of New South Wales and the people, events, and politics that prompted the call for a curb on the power of the Governor and ultimately the establishment of the Legislative Council. Today, we pick up that story with the adoption of the New South Wales Act 1823 and delve further into how empire and international practices helped shape the early history of the Legislative Council. Yet we're not alone in celebrating this very significant milestone this year. As alluded to in the conference title, the New South Wales Act has also brought the Supreme Court to New South Wales, and we're honoured to be joined by luminaries of the legal profession as they guide us through the constitutional significance of the Act and the unique early case law that differentiated New South Wales from England. However, this was not the only legacy of the Act. With this spark of good governance, New South Wales soon benefited from the establishment of the Treasury and the Audit Office, ensuring a check and balance on the use of public resources. We are, however, mindful that change does not often come easily. The Council itself, while designed to temper the power of the Governor, did not bring the representative democracy desired by the populace. Over time, this prompted agitation for greater representation and an elected council, a theme which we will conclude the conference with tomorrow. The next 2 days promise to be an illuminating and what could arguably be called a once-in-a-lifetime experience, bringing together recognised experts in their fields and building a lasting scholarly legacy that will add to the rich tapestry of our understanding of the impact of the New South Wales Act of 1823. With that in mind, I'd now like to introduce Mr David Blunt AM, the Clerk of the Parliaments, Ms Janelle Moore, Clerk Assistant and Usher of the Black Rod, as we revisit the first bicentenary conference before we move forward and ignite that spark. Thank you all so much for being here with us today, and I hope you have a genuinely fulfilling 2 days. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr President, for that warm welcome and for your acknowledgement of country. As Mr President indicated, we have an absolutely standout program of speakers planned for the next 2 days, and we're keen to get the program underway. But first, some quick housekeeping items. Each of the sessions over the next 2 days will be held here in the theatrette, that is, except for this afternoon when we go over the road to the Supreme Court. Each session will be introduced by a member of the Legislative Council or a presiding officer and will be delivered by an expert in their field. At the end of each session, there'll be a question and answer component of 15 minutes, so make sure you save up your questions. In order to indicate that you would like to ask a question during that Q&A, please raise your hand and one of the 2 roving microphones will make their way to you. For those of you following online, please write your questions into the comments function on the screen and our moderators will read them out during that Q&A session. For those of you sitting in the front 2 rows, you may see a number of people with handheld cameras make their way towards the stage at different times during the day. Please don't be alarmed, they're simply capturing images and footage of the day. So this morning we will commence with a look back at our learnings from last year's, the first bicentenary conference, 1823, the state of the colony, people, place and politics in 1823. That will be led by myself and the Usher of the Black Rod, Ms Janelle Moore. We'll then learn about New South Wales's place in the world of empire from Professor Stephen Garton before breaking for morning tea at 11 a.m. We'll meet back in the theatrette here for our next session after morning tea, in which Brett Walker and Lynn Lovelock will guide us through the tumultuous process by which the 1823 Act was enacted through the British Parliament before we break for lunch at 12:45. For those of you who have opted for the included lunch, your conference passes have been marked with a blue dot on the back. We'll be gathering in the members' lounge to enjoy a delicious meal that incorporates a selection of, quote, native Australian flavours grown in the rooftop garden here at Parliament House. Crikey, that should be quite a treat. I don't think all the produce came from the rooftop garden, but there will be some flavours from the rooftop garden. At 2 p.m, we'll depart for the special panel session at the Supreme Court across the road, where we'll hear from Chief Justice Andrew Bell, Virginia Bell AC and Keith Mason AC KC about the Chief Justices of New South Wales over the past 200 years. Following this, we will tour the original court building and hear about its colourful history before finishing for today. In order to ensure each session runs to time, we do ask that everybody comes back and is in their seats approximately 5 minutes before each session is due to start. The main exit is to your right as you exit and up the ramp to Macquarie Street. Thank you all for bearing with us with the unusual entry and exit arrangements today, but they are as a result of really important, absolutely essential heritage restoration works taking place to this building, and we're very thankful to our wonderful facilities team who are completing that excellent work, not only on budget but ahead of schedule for some big events coming up later this year. In case of an emergency, please follow the directions of the parliamentary staff. Bathrooms can be found outside in the foyer and also upstairs in the fountain court on the left-hand side. You'll also find water jugs in the theatrette foyer and a water fountain near the bathroom upstairs. If you need assistance, just speak to one of our team. They're all wearing a Legislative Council name tag or a black rod pin, and they'll be stationed in the foyer and in the fountain court during the course of the day. So, that's enough for housekeeping. Is there anything I've left out, Janelle? No. Okay, let's set the scene with a very quick recap of what we covered during last year's conference. The state of the colony, people, place and politics in 1823. The goal of last year's conference was to explore the context and conditions that led to the passage of the New South Wales Act in 1823. Our intention with each of these three conferences, last year's, this year's and next year's, yes, there will be another next year, is to leave a lasting legacy of serious scholarship and new perspectives on our early colonial history and the establishment of the institutions of government in New South Wales. We began last year with a really special session. Danielle Hromek, who is the first Aboriginal person in Australia to receive a PhD in spatial design, and she's also the director of Dinjama, which offers cultural design and research for projects in the built environment. Danielle took us through a beautiful and insightful verbal, visual history, visual-verbal history. And it was an essay, a visual verbal essay which explored the landscape and the relationship with and responses to the landscape on which this building sits. The relationship with that landscape over tens of thousands of years, as well as more recent responses from contemporary community members. It was a treat for all of those of us who were fortunate enough to be present. The day continued then with a conversation. That is, a conversation between Dr. Paul Irish, historian and archaeologist and director of Sydney firm Coast History and Heritage, and Ray Ingray, chairperson of the Gajaga Foundation, an organisation leading language, cultural and research activities within the La Perouse Aboriginal community. Paul and Ray, in conversation, discussed their research, which links together the oral stories passed down by Ray's people and written historical records to explore the lives of Sydney's coastal people. And what was that story that they told? Well, following the initial tragic impact of smallpox, which decimated the local Aboriginal population shortly after 1788, the story evolved into one of strategic relationships between the community and early governors and members of Parliament, including members of Parliament who proved to be valuable allies throughout the 19th century, ahead of the misguided and damaging policies implemented during the 20th century. Notwithstanding the ongoing legacy of these policies, the story they told is one of extraordinary ingenuity and resilience of Sydney's coastal people. Janelle, would you like to continue the story?
We concluded the first day with an esteemed panel of academic experts who explored the inquiries of John Thomas Bigg, who arrived in New South Wales in 1819 to report to Britain on every aspect of the colony. Professor Kirsten Mackenzie is Professor of History at the University of Sydney. Kirsten explained that Bigg's inquiry was part of a huge stock-taking investigation undertaken by the British government at the time across the empire to foster good governance and to prevent the revolutionary upheaval it had seen in Gulf America, France and Haiti. Kirsten observed that while Bigg's commission into New South Wales proved to be transformative, it was actually an inquiry designed to control change rather than unleash it. David Andrew Roberts is an Associate Professor of History at the University of New England, and we will have the privilege of David joining us again tomorrow. Last year, David took us through the mechanics of the Bigg inquiry, how the investigation was conducted, who Bigg spoke to, and more importantly, didn't speak to, and the monumental body of evidence behind his reports and recommendations that was left in archives until relatively recently, owing to its political sensitivity. Dr. Matthew Allen is a senior lecturer in historical criminology at the University of New England. Matthew spoke to the role of public opinion and gossip, first in informing the decision makers who sent Bigg to New South Wales in the first place, and then its influence on the views Bigg formed during his investigations. Matt suggested that the Bigg reports demonstrate that this convict colony was in some sense already becoming a democracy by virtue of what he calls an emerging democratic imaginary, a shared conviction among the colonial public that they had the right to voice their views and influence decision-making. Professor Lisa Ford is a legal historian whose prize-winning work explores ideas and practice of order in the British Empire and the early national United States from 1763 to 1850. Lisa underscored a fundamental point. The Legislative Council was not Bigg's idea. He actually had a much more inclusive model in mind that would see every law the governor made verified by an Attorney General, a council comprised of every magistrate in the colony, and laws passed by a majority vote. Lisa then touched on some of the potential sources and influences that prompted the establishment of the Legislative Council and the final model chosen. And we'll pick up on those today with Professor Stephen Garton and Brett Walker and Lynn Lovelock. That should have taken us to day two. However, at 4:30 that morning, I awoke to a text from the President's Chief of Staff advising me that Her late Majesty the Queen had passed away. This prompted the former President and the clerk to make the very difficult decision to postpone the second day of the conference so that we could prepare for a large-scale ceremony to proclaim the new King 2 days later. And it drew thousands of people in attendance, and you can see some of the people who are on screen now. But in November, the conference reconvened, and I'll hand back to David.
When day two got underway in late November, we dived straight into the politics and people of the 1820s. Kirsten Mackenzie spoke again, this time exploring scandal as an entry point into politics and the way in which, in the absence of a legislature in which political contests could be played out, the press and the courtroom were the stages on which men, and occasionally women, of influence settled scores and agitated for constitutional reform. Penny Russell is Professor Emerita at the University of Sydney, where from 1990 to 2021 she taught Australian and gender history. Also relying on sources from the press and the courtroom, Penny described the experiences of women in the colony in the early 19th century. In a male-dominated culture, the experience of The women whose stories Penny highlighted was one of danger and violence. James Dunk is a research fellow in the School of Humanities and the Sydney Environment Institute at the University of Sydney. He is the author of Bedlam at Botany Bay, which won the Australian History Prize and the 2020 New South Wales Premier's History Award. James continued the dark and sobering theme, exploring the incidence of suicide in the colony in the 1820s. He asked whether this was a spreading contagion, the consequences of dissipation and climate, or rather the natural consequences of a deliberate government policy post-Macquarie to make the colonial experience, at least that of the convicts, one of sheer terror. We then step back in time to the decade before the 1820s to consider the last governor to wield unchallenged power in New South Wales, Lachlan Macquarie. Reverend Dr. John Harris is the author of Judging the Macquaries, Injustice and Mercy in Colonial Australia. John has spent much of his life with Aboriginal people as a child, teacher, linguist and advocate, and he holds a PhD in Aboriginal languages as well as a THD in theology. John discussed Macquarie's enlightened treatment of convicts and the opposition to this policy which he faced from influential colonists against the backdrop of theological differences. John also addressed the difficult subject of Macquarie's interactions with and impacts upon Aboriginal people. Caleb Cugley, a history teacher with a particular interest in Australian colonial history, continued the examine of Macquarie and his legacy, as well as the notion of a legislative council as a restraint upon autocratic executive power.
This brings us to two of my favourite sessions. Westpack Group archivist and historian Kim Eberhard is a passionate advocate of records, archives and the stories that they hold. Kim spoke to the role of Governor Lachlan Macquarie as architect of the now famous Holy Dollars and Dumps, bringing Australia's very first currency to the colony. Kim also discussed how the disputes that occurred over the multitude of different currencies that began circulating in the colony ultimately prompted the establishment of the Bank of New South Wales and Governor Macquarie proclaiming the use of a sterling medium of monetary exchange. We were very fortunate to then have Westpac loan us some of those early currencies for display in our first bicentenary exhibition last October. If you'd like to see the coins and the other stories from our exhibition, please feel free to collect one of our commemorative booklets and they'll be available in the Fountain Court at morning tea. Next followed a wonderful session with author Jessica North. Jessica has worked at the Australian Research Institute for Environment and Sustainability at Macquarie University for the past 15 years, including 5 as its director. Jessica opened our eyes to the volume of unwritten histories that are yet to be told from the early years of New South Wales. Tales of women of influence, clever women, resilient women, bold women, but most people have never heard of them. Jessica shared the stories of Esther Abrahams, a convict single mother who became the first woman to manage a large agricultural estate, and note it wasn't Elizabeth MacArthur, Susanna Cable, the subject of the very first civil law case in Australia, Sarah Wills, the instigator of the first prenuptial agreement, and Mary Ann Piper, the child of convicts who became a society queen promoting Australia to the world. Jessica and other speakers like Ray and Paul and Danielle underscored how important it is that the perspectives of women, Aboriginal people and other groups previously silenced are now being shared.
How to close such a fascinating and enlightening two-day conference? The answer, with a very personal and inspiring presentation from one of Australia's living treasures, Ita Buttrose, AC OBE. Ita needs no introduction, beginning with personal reflections on her own childhood spent in the vicinity of Fawcluse House and playing in the grounds of Fawcluse House. She described it as the home of leading colonial political figure and press baron William Charles Wentworth. Ida's speech then touched upon the initial foundations of the separation of powers, democratic governance and, not surprisingly, the early days of an extraordinarily free press in the colony, before concluding by returning to Vaucluse House for the story of the raucous party hosted by Wentworth at that place to mark the departure of his nemesis, Governor Darling. Ida's speech was a rousing call to explore the past in our efforts to perfect our still imperfect democratic institutions whilst engaging in the ever-evolving battle of ideas. Truly inspirational.